Okay, APUSH, this is your last World War II lecture. I know, it's been a really good run. It's a sad day, but we have to move on. So this was the lecture that we were actually supposed to do on Friday when all the crazy happened. So welcome to our virtual classroom. This is your first lecture in this setting. If you have any questions, make sure that you reach out to me. And I can answer those for you. So this is, I think, going to be a longer lecture, so I'm going to split this one into two videos. So this first one, part one, is looking at the World War II home front in terms of the economy, and then my second part is going to be looking at the World War II home front from the viewpoint of various groups. Magic coffee appears. Thank you. Okay, so part one, and then later we'll get to part two. So with part one, we first want to remind ourselves kind of the context of the World War II home front, right? Because when we're talking about the home front, we're talking about literally what's going on at home in America. We spent a lot of time talking about what's going on overseas, right? What's going on in Europe, what's going on with the war in Japan, but we have yet to talk about what's going on in the United States. And remember, when World War II starts, we're still in the middle of the Great Depression, right? FDR has his first New Deal, his second New Deal, and then all of a sudden you have the attack on Pearl Harbor, and those things kind of have to take a back seat to then fighting these two fronts in World War II. And so we kind of want to remember that a lot of Americans are still kind of reeling with the effects of the Great Depression. Not everybody is working at this point. People still are struggling to pay for their basic needs. And so when the war starts, you have a lot of Americans who are a little uneasy. We know many of them are isolationists to begin with. Europe has European problems, don't involve us. And so FDR, when he declares war on Japan, he delivers a State of the Union address that year, 1941, where he's trying to reassure Americans and the world that he hasn't forgot about them, that even though he's fighting this war, he hasn't forgot about those needs at home. And so his speech, his theme of his speech is basically that Americans and the rest of the world, they have four freedoms that they're entitled to. And the first two, you're going to recognize: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, okay? But the last two, his second two freedoms, are different, and each serve a different purpose. The third freedom is a freedom from want, okay? And this is addressing Americans' maybe unease about the Great Depression and losing sight of economic recovery. He says everybody in the world, including Americans, have a right to be free from economic insecurity. So everybody should have a job. Everybody should make enough money at their job in order to meet their basic needs and to even have some luxury items. And again, this is addressing fears that he's not going to be able to recover the economy anymore because he's now fighting this war overseas. So he says, no, I haven't forgot about my economic goals. Everybody deserves freedom of economic security, okay? Freedom of want. The last freedom, his fourth freedom, is freedom from fear. And this is, again, justifying his overseas efforts. He's basically saying all of these totalitarian governments, we should be free of fear from them. We should be free from this fear that they're going to come and invade and take over. And so this freedom from national aggression is a justification for why he thinks he should go out and fight in World War II. So both of these last two freedoms, right, freedom from want and freedom from fear, they play a role in justifying why it is that he's going out and fighting this war now that many Americans were really hesitant about. Later, he's going to tack on a fifth freedom. This is in the context of the Cold War. This is the freedom of choice. And this is, again, kind of juxtaposed with communism. Freedom of choice says you should be able to choose your government, and your government should be able to basically just kind of lay off and not control the economy. You should have freedom of choice over your government and over your economic structure, which is something that communism didn't have. They're a dictatorship. We're going to talk about that next time. But that fifth freedom is in the context later of the Cold War, and Truman uses to justify his efforts against the Soviet Union. And so the economy is on everybody's mind because, again, this is still under the context of the Great Depression. And it's World War II, actually, that finally pulls America totally out of the Great Depression and completely recovers the economy. Remember when I drew that circle, that kind of cycle on the board? I think I drew it at least 100 times when we were talking about the Great Depression, where you have businesses where people stop buying stuff, right? And then as people stop buying stuff, businesses, they stop producing and they close, and then people get laid off, they lose their jobs, and then that means that they can't buy stuff because they've lost their jobs. And then just around and around we go, right? And the problem was, how do we fix this? We need to make sure that we can get people to buy stuff, because in capitalism, that's important. And then businesses will be able to produce, they'll hire, and then as people get jobs, then they can buy stuff, and we can write that cycle, okay? The New Deal attempts to give people jobs, but it's just not enough to completely recover the economy, because there's so many people out of work. 25% of America is unemployed. So while the New Deal does help some, it doesn't help all. And so it doesn't meet that final goal of recovering the entire economy. World War II, though, is able to do that. Now, why? Why would World War II be able to recover the entire economy in a way that the New Deal couldn't? It's because it's able to get America back to work in mass, okay? Remember, you need people to buy stuff. And in the United States, people just don't have enough money to buy stuff. And so businesses stay closed. But now you have a new person, a new entity who has money and wants to buy stuff, and that is the US military. During World War II, the military has this great need now to fight this war. They need weapons, they need tanks, they need uniforms, they need medical supplies. They have all this need. And so rather than consumer industries opening up during World War II, Americans go back to work in businesses that are now producing materials for the war effort, okay? So the military becomes the consumer, the one who's buying stuff, and businesses are able to reopen, meeting the demands of the military. Now, this is what gets Americans back to work, right? So people get jobs, now they're making money, now they can buy stuff. And so this opens up consumer markets too, because regular Americans don't need to buy military items. They need to buy civilian items. And so now you have civilian or consumer markets that are also opening it up. And that's what completely revives the economy. Now you have all sectors and industries that have a demand for their products, okay? Wartime manufacturing booms, therefore, during this time. You have airplanes, armored vehicles, new weaponry, that's all being produced by American manufacturing. The government is sponsoring all of these new scientific research projects, right? The atomic bomb, for instance, is one of those. The development of new weapons is kind of opening up new industries. And these new industries, they're revitalizing parts of the country that didn't have these industries before, particularly the South. This is when we start to see the Southern economy start to change. Before this, they've always been agricultural, but a lot of these wartime manufacturing industries, they open up in the South, which brings in billions of dollars of development into that region where they didn't have before. We also see this happening in the Southwest, like Southern California, Arizona, parts of Texas. You have a lot of aerospace industry opening up in parts of the Southwest, bringing millions of people to live in those parts of the country as well. So not only does World War II recover the economy, but it also moves around people and it moves around industries, opening them up to new parts of the country where they hadn't existed before. Now, the question is, who is working in all of these industries? Because we're fighting a war, and we know that when we're fighting a war, it's the young men that go and do that, right? So you have, millions and millions of men who are fighting overseas, either in Europe or in Japan. And so you have to have somebody who's making all this stuff for the military, and that burden largely falls on women. And this isn't new. Whenever we've had a war, we've talked about women who enter into the workforce. But this is a little bit different, and we're going to see why. This has a lot of implications for the 1960s reform movements, particularly feminism and women's rights movements that we see in later decades. World War II kind of starts something that's later finished in those decades. So the government starts asking women through various propaganda, and if you go through your PowerPoint slides, you'll see all my favorites are in there. I couldn't decide. There's like 20 of them in there. So enjoy. But the government starts putting out all this propaganda and posters trying to entice women to come to work. And they're using all different kinds of methodology and philosophies to do that. They're saying you're strong, you can do this. If you come to work, you can help your man who's overseas come home faster. You can meet his needs by giving him military items that he's in need for, medical items that he's in need for. Come work here in the factories so that you can help fight the war effort overseas too. So that's the message that women are hearing, and they largely meet this call. 3/4 of women in the World War II workforce are married and over the age of 35, which is really important because it's a different demographic. We've had women who have worked in the factories before. Women have been working for quite a bit of time by this point, but they're single women. So it's different now because most of these women are married and they're over the age of 35, which means they probably have children. And this is really new for the United States, because even if you were a married woman who worked, once you had children, you were home. And so this opens up a new need for daycare centers and preschool programs that open across the country, because the government is asking these married women with children to come work. They need somewhere safe for their young children to go. And so it not only changes women's roles as they go to work, but it also changes children's lives, because now they're not home, they're in these daycare and preschool centers while mom is away. This also gives women all kinds of new financial independence. Their husbands are away, they're making this money at work. They are the ones that have to figure out how best to budget for their family, what needs need to be met, what they should do with their money. And so they're not only making money, but they're choosing how to spend it, which is really new. They're also gaining all kinds of new skills. Again, women had worked in the past, but in female roles and settings, meaning that they were nurses, they were teachers, they were secretaries. Now you have people like, Rosie the Riveter, she's a welder, right? And so they're building airplanes and they're involved in heavy industries that were typically male dominated and off limits to women. You now have these women who are filling these jobs, and guess what? They find out they're good at it and they really like it. And that's what's going to be important, is that when the war ends and all the men come home, they're like, thanks so much, ladies, but you're done. These women for the first time largely say, I don't want to be done. I liked working. I have new skills. I had financial independence. And they really are kind of resentful when they have to go back home. And again, this is going to have a lot of implications later when we get to the 1960s and feminism, of why women want to go to work and want equality in those spheres. Not all women go to work, and even those who do still have a responsibility at home. And so women are working not only outside of the home, but in the home for the war effort as well. And I have some amazing propaganda on the next slides over that show you some of the government issued propaganda to try to get women to work for the war effort at home. So some of the things that they're called on to do, ration and conserve, were really big. And you have the government saying, if you eat less here, you can send that extra food to your man overseas and help him. So women, they conserve. Rationing is a government-sponsored program. So you would get these coupon books in the mail for every member of your family, and maybe it would have a coupon for a pair of shoes or a gallon of milk. You would take those to the store, you'd present them to the clerk, and they would give you that item, but that's all you got. Once you used your coupon, you couldn't get another one until you got your next book the following month. But women do this very joyfully. So they ration and they conserve. They also do my very favorite thing ever, which is plant victory gardens, okay? Because again, the emphasis is on feeding soldiers overseas. Send your food overseas. And so women start gardening in their backyards. They start making all of these gardens in their backyards, and they call them victory gardens because, again, it's going to bring victory in the war. And you would think, okay, these little gardens, like, that's sweet. They have like their tomatoes and their strawberries in their backyard. No. These are incredible. By the time we get to the end of the war in 1945, there are 20 million victory gardens in the United States, and they are producing 40% of the nation's total vegetable output during that year. So 40% of the nation's vegetables are coming from these little backyard gardens that these women are planting. It's just incredible. They also have money. So they buy war bonds and they buy stamps in order to fund the war effort overseas. And so whether they're at home or whether they're in factories outside of the home, women are working in all of these different spheres to bring victory to the war effort. Now, again, these are new roles for women, and they bring about a lot of change in their own personal lives, but they largely see it as an extension of their traditional roles. By working outside the home, by planting a victory garden in the home, they see it as a way not only to bring an end to the war, but help their husbands, their brothers, their sons, whoever is fighting that war overseas. They see it as an extension of being able to still serve their family in that way. So it plays to kind of their maternal instincts and those feminine stereotypes that they were already expected to fill, or those roles that they were expected to fill. It serves that, but it also changes their mindset, because again, they're going to find that they really like working outside the home, and that's something they want to continue doing even after the war ends. So this is it for part 1. Head on over to part 2, and we'll talk about how the home front affects various minority groups during the wartime.